Chapter 1. The rain hadn't stopped all morning, drumming a steady rhythm against the window like an impatient client. I sat behind my desk, watching the water streak down the glass and blur the chaos outside. Chicago wasn't a kind of city that slowed down for weather or murder, and I'd spent enough time here to know the difference between the two was often a matter of timing. The office smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and varnished wood, my idea of comfort these days. I was nursing a cup of coffee that was half an hour past its prime when the knock came. It wasn't a timid knock, the kind that announces bad news or a guilty conscience. This knock was steady, deliberate. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Too early for the landlord and too polite for the cops. "Come in," I called, straightening in my chair. The door opened and she swept in like a gust of expensive perfume and bad intentions. She was wrapped in a fur stole that probably cost more than my rent, and her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. Her dark hair was pinned neatly beneath a veiled hat, but it was the eyes that gave her away, red-rimmed and restless, like she'd been crying or drinking. Maybe both. "You're Evelyn Drake?" she asked, her voice a little too polished, the kind that had learned to hold back emotion. "That's what the sign says." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Have a seat, Mrs. Marlowe," she said, lowering herself into the chair with the kind of grace you don't find on Chicago's South Side. "Beatrice Marlowe." The name rang a bell. Charles Marlowe was an antiques dealer with a reputation for being both brilliant and crooked, depending on who you asked. His death had made the papers 2 days ago, a mugging gone wrong, the police said. I hadn't paid it much attention. The city chewed up men like Marlowe every week. "I read about your husband," I said, "my condolences." Her lips tightened into a line that didn't resemble a smile. "The police don't seem to share your sentiment, Miss Drake. They've written Charles off as a casualty of his own ambition." "And you think they're wrong?" "I know they're wrong," she snapped, her voice graining an edge. "Charles wasn't killed by some street thug looking for a quick payday. He was murdered for what he was carrying." I leaned back, folding my arms. "And what was he carrying?" Her hand went to the clasp of her bag, fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out a photograph. She slid it across the desk to me. The photo was black and white, grainy, but the object was clear enough. A statuette, small enough to fit in both hands, with what looked like encrusted jewels glittering along its surface. "The widow's tear," she said softly, as if naming it might summon something. I raised an eyebrow. "Catchy? What is it exactly?" "It's priceless," she said, "and dangerous." She told me the story in fits and starts, her composure slipping just enough to make me believe she wasn't completely lying. The statuette had come into her husband's possession a few weeks ago, part of a shipment he'd acquired from Europe. Charles had been thrilled, convinced the artifact would make his career. He'd been secretive, paranoid even, about its arrival. When I asked him why he was acting so strange, Beatrice said, twisting a handkerchief in her lap, he just laughed and said it was the kind of thing men kill for. "Looks like he was right," I said dryly. Her eyes flashed. "I need you to find out who killed him." "And why?" I stared at her for a long moment, weighing my options. The case smelled like trouble, but there was something in her desperation that intrigued me. It wasn't grief, not exactly. It was something sharper, hungrier. "How much are you offering?" I asked. $200, she said, and pulled an envelope from her bag. "Half now, half when you bring me answers." 200 wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't pocket change either. It'd pay the bills, and then some. I reached for the envelope, slipping it into my desk drawer. "All right, Mrs. Marlowe," I said, "I'll take the case, but I'm not promising you'll like what I find." The rain had slowed by the time I reached the dockyard where Marlowe's shipment had come in. The place reeked of fish and diesel, and the workers moved like shadows, heads down and shoulders hunched against the chill. The warehouse foreman wasn't thrilled to see me, but a little charm and a $10 bill got me inside. The place was dimly lit and cavernous, with crates stacked high enough to block out the windows. It didn't take long to find the broken crate, The wood was splintered, its contents scattered, a few shattered vases, some yellowed packing paper. But it was the torn piece of fabric caught on a nail that caught my eye. It looked like part of a coat, expensive and dark, with a jagged rip along the edge. And then I saw it, scrawled in red ink on the side of the crate, almost too faint to notice. "Stay out of it." I stepped back, my pulse quickening. This wasn't just a mugging. Someone wanted to send a message. Too bad for them. I'd never been good at taking hints. Chapter 2. The rain was still falling when I reached the office, the kind of steady downpour that muffled the city's usual chaos. The streetlights blurred in the puddles, their glow weak and watery. I climbed the stairs, the worn wooden steps creaking under my heels. Something wasn't right. The door to my office was ajar, swaying slightly in the draught from the hallway window. The lock had been jimmied, the metal bent and splintered like it had lost a fight. I stopped halfway up the last step, my hand tightening around the key in my pocket. "Nice touch," I muttered to no one, pulling the revolver from my coat. The office was dark, but the streetlight outside cast just enough light through the blinds to show me the mess. The desk drawers were yanked open, their contents spilled onto the floor. Papers, pens, and the remnants of my lunch were scattered across the rug. The filing cabinet was tipped over, its steel guts exposed. And standing in the middle of it all was a man I didn't recognize. He was broad-shouldered and thick-necked, stuffed into a cheap pinstriped suit that didn't quite fit. His hat was pushed back, revealing a flat nose that looked like it had been broken more than once. He wasn't moving, just standing there with his arms crossed and a smirk on his face, like he'd been waiting for me. "Evening, Mrs. Drake," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I stayed in the doorway, keeping my gun at my side. "You planning on leaving a card, or is this your idea of subtle?" He chuckled, taking a step closer. "You're poking around in things that don't concern you." "Funny. That's what people usually hire me to do," I said. His smile faded. "Walk away from the Marlowe case. That's not a request." I raised the gun, levelling it at his chest. "And this isn't a negotiation." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he lunged. He was fast for a big guy, but desperation's a good motivator. I sidestepped his charge, slamming the door shut with my free hand. He spun around, his fists raised, but I kept the revolver steady. "Don't be stupid," I said, my voice low. His lip curled, but he stopped moving. "That's better," I said. "Now, why don't you tell me who sent you before I decide how many holes to put in that soot?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes darting toward the window. I saw it coming too late. The lamp on my desk shattered as he threw it at me, the bulb exploding in a shower of sparks. I ducked, and he bolted, shoving past me and out the door before I could recover. By the time I reached the hallway, he was gone, his heavy footsteps echoing down the stairwell. The office was a wreck. I picked up the broken lamp, shaking glass off my desk as I tried to piece together what he'd been after. Most of the drawers were empty, and nothing seemed missing, but his warning stuck with me. "Walk away." I didn't know who had sent him, but one thing was clear. Whoever wanted me off this case was willing to make it personal. The next morning the rain had given way to a thick fog that wrapped around the city like a damp shroud. I headed to the speakeasy where Marlowe had been known to do business. The place was tucked behind an unmarked door in the basement of a crumbling brick building. The inside was everything you'd expect. Dim lighting, smoke hanging in the air like a second ceiling, and a jazz trio playing a tune so smooth it felt like silk. The bartender was a wiry man with slick-back hair and a sharp jawline. He glanced up as I approached, his eyes narrowing. "Oh, what'll it be?" he asked, wiping a glass with a towel that didn't look any cleaner than the glass. "Information," I said, sliding a folded bill across the bar. He raised an eyebrow, but pocketed the money. "About what?" "Charles Marlowe," I said. "He was a regular here, wasn't he?" The bartender's face didn't change, but his hands stilled. "Used to be. Haven't seen him in a while." "He's dead," I said flatly. The bartender exhaled through his nose, then leaned in closer. "Figures. He been running with the wrong crowd. Had a meeting here last month with Victor Langley." "Langley?" I repeated. The name was familiar. an art collector with a reputation for taking what he wanted, whether it was for sale or not. "Yeah," the bartender said. "Langley's got deep pockets and a mean streak. Whatever Marlowe was into, Langley was interested." "What about Marlowe's wife?" I asked. He hesitated. "Can't say for sure, but Marlowe wasn't the faithful type, always meeting someone different, sometimes dames, sometimes men in sharp suits and talk much." I left the speakeasy with more questions than answers. If Langley was involved, Marlowe's death wasn't random and the statuette wasn't just a curiosity. But what about Beatrice? She'd painted herself as the grieving widow, desperate for answers, but the picture wasn't adding up. If Marlowe had been mixed up with someone like Langley, Beatrice had to know more than she was letting on. The fog swallowed me as I stepped onto the street, the city humming faintly in the distance. Somewhere in the mess of lies and half-truths, the truth was waiting. I just had to find it before someone else found me. Chapter 3. Chicago didn't wake up quietly, and neither did I. The blare of a car horn outside my window dragged me out of a restless sleep. My office couch was no substitute for a bed, but it was where I'd been spending most of my nights. After the break-in, I wasn't taking chances. The morning paper was waiting outside my door, folded neatly as if the news it carried wasn't a mess of its own. My eyes skimmed the headlines, but it wasn't the politics or the crime blotter that stopped me. It was a short notice buried in the society section. "Langley Collection hosts exclusive auction tonight." Victor Langley wasn't wasting time. If he'd had anything to do with Charles Marlowe's death, he wasn't showing it. The Langley auction was the kind of event that glittered from the outside and rotted on the inside. The ballroom of the Hotel Atlantic was dressed to impress. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, and champagne flowed like water. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than my office filled the space with laughter and whispers. I'd borrowed a dress of my own, nothing fancy, but enough to keep me from standing out. I didn't need the attention, not yet. Langley was easy to spot. He stood near the centre of the room, flanked by a pair of tall men whose posture screamed bodyguard. Langley himself was slim and sharp, with a smile that could cut glass. He held a champagne flute as if it were an extension of his hand, his polished charm radiating like the shine off his cufflinks. I made my way to him, weaving through the crowd until his eyes caught mine. Oh, his smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Drake," he said smoothly. "What a surprise." "Mr. Langley," I replied. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," he said, gesturing to the glass in my hand. "I take it you're enjoying the champagne?" "I take it you're enjoying the attention," I said. "But I didn't come here for drinks or small talk." His smile tightened. "And what did you come for?" "Charles Marlowe," I said. Langley's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered for half a second. "A tragedy," he said, his tone practiced. "I barely knew the man." "That's not what I heard," I said, stepping closer. "Word is, you were very interested in something he had, something called a widow's tear." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You've been listening to the wrong people, Miss Drake. The statuette is nothing more than a pretty trinket." "Pretty enough to get a man killed?" I asked. Langley's smile disappeared. "Careful," he said, his voice dropping. "You're starting to sound reckless." "And you're starting to sound guilty," I shot back. He stepped closer, the scent of his cologne sharp and clean. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but let me give you a piece of advice. Quit while you're ahead. The Marlowe case is a dead end, and digging into it will only get you hurt." I held his gaze for a long moment before stepping back. "Thanks for the advice," I said, turning toward the exit. "But I've never been much of a quitter." I left the auction with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Langley was hiding something. The cold night air was a slap to the face as I stepped outside, the din of the ballroom fading behind me. I pulled my coat tighter and started down the sidewalk, the sound of my heels echoing off the buildings. That's when I felt it, the prickling sensation of being watched. A man in a black fedora stood under the glow of a street lamp, his face obscured by the brim. He didn't move, didn't try to hide, but something about the way he stood made my pulse quicken. I picked up my pace, turning the corner onto a quieter street. The shadows stretched long and thin, the hum of the city muffled by the fog rolling in from the river. I didn't need to look back to know he was following me. The revolver in my pocket was a comforting weight, but I didn't want to use it, not yet. I ducked into an alley, pressing myself against the wall. My breath was shallow, my hand resting on the gun. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. When the man stepped into the alley, I levelled the revolver at his chest. "Mind telling me why you're following me?" I asked. He froze, his hands halfway to his coat pockets. "I wasn't following you," he said, his voice calm. "Don't lie to me," I said, cocking the gun. He smirked, the kind of smirk that made me want to wipe it off his face. "Relax, Miss Drake. I was hired to keep an eye on you, not hurt you." "By who?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Someone who doesn't want you digging any deeper." I didn't lower the gun. "Give me a name." "I can't do that," he said. "But I can tell you this. The widow's tear is more than just a statue. It's a key." "A key to what?" His smirk returned. "That's for you to figure out. Just be careful who you trust." With that he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the alley with more questions than I could count. Back at my office I poured myself a stiff drink and stared at the city through the rain-streaked window. A key. That's what he'd called it. If the widow's tear was a key, then what it opened was big enough to kill for. Langley had warned me to quit, and now this shadow in a fedora had confirmed it. Whatever I was chasing, it wasn't just about money or art. It was about power. Chapter 4. Chicago wore its filth well. The rain had cleared, leaving the city scrubbed clean on the surface, but the grime was still there, tucked between the cracks where only a fool wouldn't look. I wasn't much for fooling myself, which is why I didn't trust the sudden quiet that followed me into the night. The meeting with Beatrice was set for 7 p.m. at an out-of-the-way cafe on the edge of the loop. The place had seen better days. Its chipped counters and threadbare booths bore witness to years of quiet desperation and burnt coffee. I was early, she wasn't. When Beatrice finally walked in, she was dressed to kill. Figuratively, I hoped. Her veil was drawn tight over her face, her fur stole perfectly draped over her shoulders. She slid into the booth across from me without so much as a nod. "You wanted an update?" I said, lighting a cigarette. "I've got one." She leaned forward slightly, her gloved hands folded neatly on the table. "And?" "I've been hearing some interesting things about your husband," I said, exhaling smoke in a slow stream. "Word is, he wasn't just dealing in antiques. He was smuggling. Jewelry, art, maybe even weapons." Beatrice stiffened, but her voice stayed even. "That's absurd." "Is it?" I asked, stubbing out the cigarette. "Because it seems to me that the widow's tear wasn't just a lucky find, it was part of something bigger. Something that got him killed." Her hands tightened, the gloves creaking faintly. "I told you everything I know." "Sure," I said, "but maybe you left out the part where you knew exactly what kind of trouble your husband was in." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't say anything. "It wasn't like I couldn't find it out," she said, slightly reluctantly, but she didn't say anything. That was answer enough. I left the cafe with a sour taste in my mouth, and Beatrice's words echoing in my head. She was hiding something big. I'd put money on it. The walk back to my office was short, but the unease that followed me was longer. I'd barely stepped into the building when I knew I wasn't alone. The men waiting for me in my office didn't bother with pleasantries. There were 3 of them, dressed sharp enough to pass for Langley's bodyguards, but with the kind of dead eyes that belong to hired killers. "Miss Drake," the tallest one said, his voice as smooth as polished silver, "Mr. Langley would like a word." "I'll bet he would," I said, shrugging off my coat. "But I've had a long day. Tell him to send a letter." The man smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "I'm afraid this isn't a request." The meeting with Langley was held in a penthouse that reeked of money and menace. He was seated behind a mahogany desk, a glass of something expensive in one hand, and a thin cigar in the other. "You've been busy," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "Work keeps me out of trouble," I said, staying on my feet. Langley chuckled. "And yet you seem to find plenty of it. Tell me, Miss Drake, what do you know about the widow's tear?" I said. His smile dropped from his face. "I don't take kindly to threats, Miss Drake." "Good," I said, because that wasn't one. The conversation didn't last much longer. Langley made his point clear. I was to leave the statuette alone, or I'd regret it. I didn't make it 3 blocks before I ran into the next complication. The alley was dark and narrow, the kind of place the city forgot about. Roscoe Red Harlow wasn't the kind of man you forgot, though. He was leaning against the brick wall, his red hair slicked back, a crooked grin plastered across his freckled face. "I hear you've been asking questions," he said, stepping into my path. "Here's some free advice," he said, his grin widening. "Stop." "And if I don't?" He leaned in close, the stench of whiskey and tobacco heavy on his breath. "Then I'll stop you myself." The night wasn't over yet. By the time I reached my apartment, my nerves were raw. I barely had time to pour a drink before the knock came. Celeste Duval was standing in the doorway, a vision in emerald silk. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were colder than Langley's. "May I come in?" she asked. "Why not?" I said, stepping aside. "The rest of the city seems to think my office is open to everyone." She laughed softly, the sound like champagne bubbles bursting. "I'm here to help," she said, settling into the armchair like she owned it. "That's funny," I said, pouring another drink, "because you look like trouble." "Trouble and opportunity are often the same thing," she said, crossing her legs. "Hand over the statuette and I can make all your problems disappear." I didn't answer right away, swirling the whiskey in my glass as I watched her. "And what do I get in return?" "Your life," she said, smiling sweetly. By the end of the night, I was knee-deep in enemies. Langley's men wanted me to stop digging, Harlow's gang wanted me out of their way, and Celeste wanted me to sell my soul for a chance to breathe easy. The trouble was, I wasn't sure I could trust anyone, least of all Beatrice. Her grief was looking more like a costume, and the string she was pulling was starting to show. If I wasn't careful, she'd be the one pulling mine. Chapter 5. The mansion looked like it had been dead for decades, a husk of what it once was. Its broken windows and peeling paint stared back at me like a skull missing its eyes. The place sat on the edge of the city, shrouded by fog and silence, its iron gates hanging open as if daring me to step inside. I parked my car a few yards away and checked the revolver in my coat pocket. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but if the past few days had taught me anything, it was that the widow's tear didn't come without trouble. Inside, the air was thick with dust and mildew. The grand foyer was littered with debris, fallen plaster, broken furniture, shards of glass from the once elegant chandelier that hung above. My footsteps echoed in the vast space as I moved through the shadows, flashlight in hand. The ballroom was worse. The high windows were streaked with grime, letting in only slivers of pale moonlight. Tattered curtains hung limp against the walls, and the parquet floor creaked under my weight. In the corner sat a grand piano, its lid splintered and keys yellowed with age. That's when I saw it! The faint glint of something jewelled, just visible in the moonlight. It was tucked into the hollow cavity where the piano's hammers should have been. I approached slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. The statuette was smaller than I'd imagined, but it was every bit as beautiful as Beatrice had described. The widow's tear sat nestled in the dust, its gemstones winking like secrets. I reached for it. "Not so fast!" The voice stopped me cold. Beatrice Marlowe stepped out of the shadows, her fur stole trailing like a phantom's tail. The veil was gone, revealing a face as hard and polished as the statuette itself. In her hand was a pistol, steady and aimed at me. Behind her came Victor Langley, his suit impeccable as ever, his own gun drawn. His smile was still sharp, but now it was laced with something darker. Triumph? "I have to hand it to you, Miss Drake," Beatrice said. "You've been more resourceful than I gave you credit for." "Glad to be of service," I said, keeping my hands where they could see them. "Now why don't you tell me what this is really about?" Beatrice's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Did you really think Charles stumbled onto this by chance? He was a fool, always chasing the next big deal, but he wasn't smart enough to see what he had." "And you were?" "I was," she said, her voice sharpening. "The widow's tear isn't just a trinket, it's a key, a map to a fortune hidden in the chaos of the Great War. Charles didn't deserve it, he didn't deserve any of it." Langley chuckled, his gun trained on me. "So, she had him removed. Clean and simple." I looked at Beatrice, the pieces falling into place. "You killed your husband," her smile widened. "Not personally, but I arranged it. And thanks to you, I don't have to dig through this wreck myself to get what I want." "You're welcome," I said dryly. Langley stepped closer, his gun never wavering. "Unfortunately, Beatrice, your plan has a flaw." Beatrice stiffened. "What are you talking about?" Langley's smile turned wolfish. "You're no better than Charles. Greedy, careless, and ultimately expendable." Her eyes narrowed, her gun twitching toward Langley. "Don't be stupid, Victor. You need me." "I needed you," he corrected, his tone almost bored. "Now I need the statuette, and you, my dear, are in the way." The room was silent, the tension so thick it felt like the air had turned to molasses. "Looks like you two have a lot to work out," I said, taking a step back. "Stay where you are," Langley snapped, his attention snapping back to me. "You're not going anywhere." I had 2 guns pointed at me and 1 revolver in my pocket. The odds weren't in my favour, but I'd dealt with worse. "Here's the thing about greed," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It makes people careless." Langley frowned, his grip tightening on his gun. Beatrice's gaze darted between us, her confidence starting to crack. "What are you—" Langley started, but he didn't get to finish. I lunged, grabbing the statuette and using the piano as cover as Beatrice fired. The shot went wide, splintering the wood near my shoulder. I rolled to the side, pulling my revolver and firing at Langley. The bullet caught his arm, making him drop his gun with a curse. Beatrice screamed, her aim wild as she fired again. I ducked behind a toppled chair, my heart pounding in my chest. When the dust settled, Langley was on the floor, clutching his bleeding arm. Beatrice stood frozen, her gun dangling from her hand as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. "Drop it," I said, stepping out from behind the chair, my own revolver trained on her. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw the grief she'd worn like a mask. But it wasn't grief for Charles. It was for herself, for everything she'd lost in her quest for more. The gun slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. I called the cops from a payphone down the road. When they arrived, I handed over Beatrice, Langley, and the widow's tear. "Not your usual case," one of the officers said, giving me a sideways glance. "No," I said, lighting a cigarette, "but nothing ever is." As I watched the squad car disappear into the fog, I couldn't help but wonder if the fortune the widow's tear promised was worth all the lives it had cost. But that wasn't my problem anymore. My job was done, and for now, that... Chapter 6. The statuette felt heavier than it should have, its jewelled surface glinting dully in the moonlight. In my hand, the widow's tear was no longer a priceless artifact. It was a ticking time bomb. Langley groaned from the floor, cradling his wounded arm. Beatrice stood a few feet away, her face pale, her polished facade crumbling by the second. The ballroom was silent, save for the creak of the old floorboards beneath my boots. "I hope you're proud of yourselves," I said, turning the statuette over in my hands, "because whatever game you were playing is about to be over." Langley sneered, his lips curling back like a dog backed into a corner. "You don't even know what you're holding, Miss Drake." "Don't I?" I asked, tilting my head. Langley's smirk faltered. Beatrice, on the other hand, stayed silent, her gloved hands trembling at her sides. The hidden latch was almost invisible, a hairline seam running along the statuette's base. It was the kind of detail you'd only notice if you were looking for it. I'd seen it back in the piano, but hadn't had time to act on it. Now, with Langley and Beatrice disarmed, I pressed the edge of my thumbnail into the groove. The compartment popped open with a faint click. Inside was a stack of folded papers, yellowed with age but intact. I pulled them out, careful not to damage the fragile edges, and unfolded the first page. "What is that?" Beatrice asked, her voice tight with fear. I didn't answer right away, my eyes scanning the document. It was a ledger, meticulously handwritten, detailing a series of transactions, shipments, dates, and sums of money that could buy and sell half of Chicago. The entries tied Langley and Marlowe to an illegal smuggling operation stretching across the Atlantic. But it was the second paper that made my stomach turn. A letter addressed to Beatrice Marlowe, outlining her husband's review in careful, bloodless language. The signature at the bottom was Victor Langley's. "Well, would you look at that?" I said, holding up the papers. "Your little statuette wasn't just a key to a fortune. It was a record. Insurance in case one of you decided to stab the other in the back." Langley's face darkened, his charm replaced by something meaner. "You think you've won, Miss Drake. Those documents don't prove a thing. They'll be laughed out of court." "Maybe," I said, "but they'll look real nice on the front page of tomorrow's Tribune." Beatrice's composure cracked. "You wouldn't dare!" "Try me," I said, folding the papers and slipping them into my coat pocket. The tension in the room was razor-sharp. Langley shifted on the floor, his good hand inching toward his discarded gun. Beatrice took a hesitant step toward me, her eyes darting between the statuette and my pocket. "You think you're so clever," she said, her voice trembling, "but you're in over your head. Those papers don't just incriminate us, they expose people far more powerful than you." "Maybe so," I said, keeping my voice calm. "But I'm not the one standing here with blood on my hands." Langley made his move. He lunged for the gun, his wounded arm shaking with effort. I was faster. The revolver was in my hand before he could reach his, the barrel levelled at his chest. "Don't," I said, my voice low and steady. He froze, his eyes narrowing. That's when the sirens started. The sound cut through the stillness, growing louder by the second. Beatrice's eyes widened, her head whipping toward the broken windows. Langley's face went pale. "You called the cops," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course I did," I said. "You didn't think I'd walk in here without a backup plan, did you?" The front doors burst open, and a flood of uniformed officers poured into the mansion. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the scene like a grotesque stage play. "Over here!" I called, lowering my gun but keeping it ready. The officers moved quickly, cuffing Langley and Beatrice before either of them could protest. As they were led away, Langley turned back to me, his face twisted with rage. "This isn't over, Drake. You think you've won, but you haven't." "Keep telling yourself that," I said, lighting a cigarette. Beatrice didn't say anything as they took her, but her eyes burned with a quiet fury that sent a chill down my spine. Once the mansion was empty, I handed the statuette and the documents over to the lead detective. "This should be enough to keep them busy for a while," I said. He nodded, tucking the papers into his coat. "You did good work, Drake. Dangerous, but good." "That's the job," I said, blowing out a stream of smoke. He tipped his hat and left, leaving me alone in the ballroom. The drive back to the city was quiet, the road stretching out like a dark ribbon in front of me. My ribs ached, my head throbbed, my coat reeked of mildew and mildew. But I'd done it. Beatrice and Langley were finished, their schemes exposed for the world to see. The widow's tear was in the hands of the authorities, its secrets no longer a mystery. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. Chapter 7. The office was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city outside. Rain drummed a steady rhythm against the window, the sound soft and unrelenting, like an old tune I couldn't forget. I sat at my desk, the papers from the Marlowe case spread out in front of me. They were the remnants of something that had cost more than they were worth. Lives, trust, and a piece of myself I wasn't sure I'd get back. The lamp cast a dim circle of light across the desk, the shadows stretching long and sharp across the room. In the corner, the filing cabinet leaned slightly to the left, a dent from the night I'd thrown it open, looking for answers. The answers had come, all right, but they'd left a sour taste I couldn't wash down. I poured a glass of bourbon. the amber liquid catching the light as I tipped the bottle. The first sip burned, but the second went down smooth. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling as the events of the past few days played out in my mind like a film reel. Charles Marlowe was dead, his life snuffed out over a statuette that turned out to be more trouble than it was worth. Beatrice was in a cell, her perfect widow act stripped away to reveal the greed underneath. Langley was nursing his wounded pride and his wounded arm in a holding cell downtown, and the widow's tear? It was locked away somewhere in evidence, its secrets catalogued and filed like a relic from another time. I should have felt good about that. Justice, or something close to it, had been served, but all I could think about were the bodies left in the wake of that little jewelled trinket. Marlowe, the unlucky smuggler who thought he could outwit the people around him. The dock worker I'd found with a bullet in his chest, just a loose end in someone else's game. Even Beatrice, twisted as she was, had been a victim of her own ambition. I stared at the glass in my hand, the bourbon swirling lazily. What good had it done? The world wasn't any cleaner, and I wasn't any richer. All I'd managed was to scrape a little more dirt off the surface, knowing there was more underneath. The rain picked up, hammering against the window in waves. I stood and walked over, the glass cool under my fingers as I stared out at the city below. The lights blurred into streaks of yellow and red, the cars and streetcars moving like ghosts through the fog. I caught my reflection in the glass. Hollow eyes, a line of exhaustion etched into my mouth. I looked older than I felt, or maybe I felt older than I looked. It didn't matter. The case was done, but the city wasn't. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch. Eventually I walked back to the desk, sliding the bourbon bottle into the drawer. "Come in," I said, my voice raspier than I'd intended. The door creaked open and a young man stepped inside. He couldn't have been more than 25, with a nervous energy that made him look like a kid in a grown man's suit. "You miss me, Drake?" he asked, twisting his hat in his hands. "That's what the sign says," I replied, sinking back into my chair. "What can I do for you?" "My sister," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "She's missing. Nobody'll help me. The cops, they don't care." I studied him for a long moment, weighing the desperation in his eyes against the exhaustion in my bones. "Have a seat," I said finally, nodding to the chair across from me. He sat, still clutching the hat like it was the only thing keeping him steady. I reached for my notepad, the pencil resting where I'd left it. "All right," I said, the words coming easier now. "Start from the beginning." As he talked, I let my mind wander to the decision I'd made an hour ago, standing by the window. The world was dirty, and the people in it were worse. But someone had to pull at the threads, unravel the lies, and dig for the truth. It wasn't a clean job, and it wasn't easy, but it mattered. The bourbon in my glass, the rain outside, the cases piling up, they were all part of it, the cost of doing what I did, and for now that was enough to keep going. Chapter 8. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long slats of gold across the office floor. For once the city outside seemed calm, as if it had finally decided to catch its breath. I was rearranging the papers on my desk, trying to put some order to the chaos that had overtaken my life the past few weeks. The file on the Marlowe case sat neatly in the centre, closed, but still heavy in a way no paper should be. Beside it, a small glittering object caught the light. The widow's tear. It didn't look like much anymore, just a jewelled trinket that had cost too many lives and caused too much trouble. It sat there like a trophy I hadn't asked for, a reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. The hidden compartment was empty now, its secrets catalogued and locked away by the authorities. All that was left was the cold weight of its frame. I set it back down, its allure long gone. The door creaked open and I looked up. She was young, couldn't have been more than 30, with a face that had seen more trouble than it should have. Her coat was buttoned tight against the chill, and her hands clutched a worn leather purse like it was the only thing she had left. "Miss Drake?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "That's me," I said, leaning back in my chair. "What can I do for you?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the mess of papers on my desk, then to the statuette. Finally, she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "It's about my husband," she said, her fingers tightening on the purse strap. "He's gone." I tilted my head. Gone where? Her lips pressed together, and for a moment I thought she might bolt, but then she took a deep breath and sat down across from me. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think someone took him, and I think it's because of something he did." I folded my hands on the desk, watching her closely. "What kind of something?" She hesitated again, then pulled a small envelope from her purse and placed it on the desk. He was involved in some business. I didn't ask questions. I should have, but I didn't, and now he's gone. I reached for the envelope, sliding it open. Inside was a photograph, slightly crumpled at the edges. It showed a man in his late 30s standing in front of what looked like a dockyard. His smile was strained, and his arm was slung over the shoulder of another man, a man I recognized, Langley. I leaned back, my fingers tapping lightly on the desk. The weight of the photo felt heavier than it should have. "You sure you want to know the truth?" I asked, meeting her eyes. She didn't flinch. "Yes." I nodded, reaching for my notepad. "It's never simple," I said, flipping to a clean page. "But let's hear it. Start from the beginning." As she talked, the familiar rhythm of her words settled into the room. Her story was different, but the threads were the same. Secrets, lies, and the kind of greed that left nothing but wreckage in its wake. The city was full of people like her, chasing answers they didn't always want, but that was the job, wasn't it? Digging through the lies to find the truth, no matter how ugly it was. I glanced at the widow's tear one last time. It sat quietly on the desk, stripped of its power, nothing more than an ornament. But in its stillness, it carried a lesson. Every case had a cost, and every truth came with a price. I turned back to the woman, my pencil poised over the notepad. "All right," I said. "Let's get to work. Thank you for sticking with me until the very end of this story. Your support means everything, and I truly appreciate you taking the time to dive into these detective tales with me. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more stories filled with mystery, intrigue, and unforgettable twists. There's plenty more to come, and I'd love to have you along for the ride. Stay tuned till the end to hear more of the implausible adventures of the masked monster. Your engagement helps the channel grow, and I can't wait to share even more thrilling cases with you. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think, or which mysteries you'd like to see next. Until the next case, stay curious and keep an eye on the shadows.